Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar. We appreciate that you've joined us, regardless of what time zone you might be in, for this web seminar titled A History of Violence, Mexico and the United States. My name is Andy Mink, and I'm the Vice President of Education here at the National Humanities Center. I'm joining you tonight from my home in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, about 20 minutes to the west of the center. And also at our home tonight is Libby Taylor, my colleague at the center, who is solely responsible for really pulling these webinars together in terms of managing the registration, communicating with all of you. I think we had 175 teachers from across the country signed up tonight, working with the lead scholar like Elaine to pull together the PowerPoint. And Libby will also be available for any kinds of troubleshooting or problems you might have. And I would encourage you, if tonight's session really speaks to content that you feel is important and relevant for your classroom, that you reach out to Libby or myself and perhaps think of ways that we can work more directly with you and your system, your school district, or your faculty. It strikes me that really a crucial function of teaching seems to be unteaching, actually, or it's the unlearning of all those impressions and assumptions and misconceptions that students often bring into our classrooms. And sometimes these misinformed beliefs are intentional. They're from parents and family or friends or social media or the media itself. And sometimes they are just simply a lack of understanding. Words get used and misused, and before long, that belief is caramelized into fact, at least fact for the students as they walk in the room. Several weeks ago, we hosted a webinar here at the Humanities Center with Kelly Lyle Hernandez from UCLA, who spoke about and discussed the history of border control of the U.S. I think tonight's session, in some ways, can be seen as the other side of that wall, that proverbial wall, even the one that's not yet built and funded. And really, I think what we're trying to do is attempt to provide you, teachers, educators, with contextual understanding and a set of resources that will allow you to both teach and unteach. Immigration and displaced migration has firmly inserted itself in, it seems, every conversation that's had about policy and culture in today's world. And our session tonight is really intended to provide a clearer look at the push-pull factors, the unintended consequences of the movement of people, and specifically the role of violence in the displacement of Mexican citizens. The primary goal of our webinar series generally is to give you, educators, an opportunity to work directly with scholars like Elaine to really talk through the scholarship and the emerging understandings in these kinds of relevant topics. We will discuss and allude to and explicitly think about ways to take this into your classroom. And we hope that really all the work here at the Humanities Center encourages that kind of conversation and debate and co-learning that transcends curriculum. The National Humanities Center is pleased tonight to partner with the American Historical Association on this webinar. AHA has worked for many years to support teachers of all levels with strong scholarship and direct lines to scholars. And we very much appreciate their help, not only in setting up tonight's webinar and in promoting it, but really serving as that spine, that work that we do here at the center. Humanities Center, for the last 40 years, we're coming up on our 4-decade anniversary, is intended to build humanities advocacy around a deeper understanding of humanities as tools to better understand the world that we live in. We like to do that primarily through content, through an understanding of that world, and then work hard to translate that for students and interested purveyors of all ages. In many cases, this personal and professional transformation occurs with that deeper understanding, and we encourage all of you to see yourself as a part of this community. We're going to invite you in a couple of different ways tonight to join us, to contribute, and to be a part of the good work that we're doing. One of those ways may be access to the American class lessons and resources we have available. These resources are free and open to the public. They are written with scholarly input and vetting. They're intended to be rigorous, they're intended to be relevant, and they're intended to be materials that you can take into your classroom and differentiate to your own needs and your own interests. The professional development webinars like the one you're attending tonight is also a big part of the way we try to connect these two worlds. I do want to thank all of you for being patient over the last few weeks as we've had some springtime illnesses and some logistical snafus. We've had to postpone several of them, but I think you'll find if you go to our website that we still have 4 or 5 very compelling topics coming up, and we appreciate all of your ongoing and regular support of these webinars. As a matter of fact, we are experimenting, we're tinkering with ways to make this better. I think you'll find tonight's webinar will be provocative and engaging and interactive, but we want to make it better. And so we have added 3 experimental webinars for the month of May. And in each case, we're going to be using a different platform. Tonight, we're using Adobe Connect, and I think you'll find it's a little bit like driving your dad's Chevy. It's sturdy and dependable, but there's not a lot of bells and whistles. So we are going to add 3 different platforms for a session next week, May 2nd, on fake news, on May 9th on rock and roll across the humanities, and on May 16th with the Smithsonian and work with their digital artifacts. And for you, this should work exactly as it is tonight. That is, register and attend and participate. But I think you'll find the look, the feel will be much more interactive, much more media saturated, and hopefully more seamless, more engaging for you. So if you haven't signed up, I'd encourage both you to, and as well as to share it with your colleagues and with your friends. I also want to invite all of you to consider applying for the Teachers Advisory Council. We are currently accepting applications from K-12 teachers across the country to be a part of our 14-person advisory council. This is a 1-year term, and if selected, we'll invite you to participate and contribute in a variety of ways. That includes a 2-day humanities orientation boot camp in Durham, North Carolina next fall. It includes a modest yet important stipend, and it includes an invitation to participate in a variety of professional development activities. You can find the application at the link at the top there. I'm going to ask Libby to also put it in the chat box so you can just simply click it. And we are accepting applications until June the 1st. We would love to have your interest, and we would love to have you serve with us and contribute to the Humanities Center in this manner. One of the ways that we are continuing to work with schools is through the Humanities Moments campaign. You'll be hearing much more about this as the year goes on, but this is a model in which we can work in schools and with both faculty and communities and students on identifying those moments in which the humanities have proved and provided a very important lens to the world they live in. I think you'll find by going to the link humanitiesmoments.org, there are a variety of compelling moments already in the archive, and we'll be soliciting these from stakeholders and students and teachers from all over the country to add to that. But tonight we're here to talk about the history of violence and the role that violence has played in the relationship between Mexico and the U.S. And again, we're very pleased to have you here at the webinar. Tonight's webinar will be an audio-only webinar anchored by a PowerPoint that Elaine has put together with us. Your participation, however, is very critical, and that's going to happen in the chat box in the lower right-hand corner. So I would encourage you to register your questions and your thoughts. Greet your friends, tell us where you're from, and specifically to respond to the kinds of prompts and the kinds of questions that Elaine will be articulating. As we move through the webinar, you'll also find at the very end an evaluation, and by completing that evaluation, you can download your certificate of participation. Ultimately, and I am recording this webinar tonight, ultimately, I think you'll benefit from not just the conversation, not just the chat, but the materials associated with it. And so this recording and all of the work that comes with it will be available to you within the next 48 hours on our website, and you'll be able to download that and use them in a variety of ways. Finally, I do want to encourage you to consider this conversation as more than just the 50, soon to be 100 people, teachers in the virtual room tonight. We all have social and professional networks behind us, and I would encourage you to follow us on Twitter, to follow us on Facebook, to find ways to register good thoughts about the work that we're doing, things that resonate, ideas that connect, and please use the hashtags and the Twitter handles to do so, and it just brings you just a little bit closer into the community that we've built here. So that's my introduction, and I had hoped to make that as short and as brief as possible because I really want to give Elaine Carey, Professor of History, currently at St. John's, but soon to be the Dean of the College of Humanities, Education, and Social Sciences at Purdue University Northwest. I wanted to give Elaine an opportunity to really to lead most of tonight's conversation. Number one, I can tell you that this is by far the most provocative opening slide, title, and image. And anytime I can introduce a speaker with a title like "Women, Drug Traffickers, Mules, Bosses, and Organized Crime," I feel like we're really using the humanities as a lens to understand this world. I can recite all of Elaine's long accomplishments and publications and the good work she's done in the scholarly field. But I think what's most important is that I really emphasize, both in my own experience and knowing Elaine and the work that she does, how absolutely credible she is as an educator, the way that she approaches teaching and learning and the value she places on it, and really I think the collegial way that that she works with teachers themselves. So I'm very pleased that Elaine can join us tonight, and I'm going to unmute her and hand her the microphone, so to speak, and invite Elaine for you to say hello and join us, lead us in this PowerPoint.
Good evening, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here. I hope everybody can hear me. And before we begin, I just want to share my email because I am in transition. And so if you have any questions or thoughts afterwards, you can email me at my Gmail account, which is right there. So please feel
Perfect.
free to ask me anything, even if you decide 3 weeks from now. So I want to thank Andy for this wonderful introduction and this opportunity, and also Libby for going back and forth with me many times about the slides. And all the slides, except for a couple, are in the public domain. So they are cited, and so I encourage you to use them. And I'll also kind of tell you where some interesting things are to find. I also want to thank the American Historical Association, who I've been a longtime member with the organization, who has been really great with getting out the word and tweeting about this particular webinar. So before we begin, I have a couple questions I want to ask you. And I've noticed just from where you're putting up, where you're teaching, that I have a feeling this is going to be a pretty good response. How many of you have taken a Latin American or a Mexican history class while studying in college or afterwards? Please just feel free to type in. And I'll just pause here for a moment.
So, Elaine, we have a whole
So
lot of
Latin American
California teachers.
politics.
Yeah,
I know you do. I was thrilled. So I was like, oh yeah, there's going to be
Chicago.
some.
That's right.
So okay. So Chicano studies too, Latin American politics. Great. Okay. Race and gender in Latin America, Mexican history. Excellent. Obviously from Argentina, you would definitely take some Latin American history in college. Okay, excellent. So now I have a follow-up question. How many of you teach a Latin American or Mexican history course? Or do you maybe teach Latin America or Mexico within world history or even US history?
Mm.
Okay, one chapter. Okay, within world history,
Boy,
Latin
that
American
sums it
world
up, doesn't it?
history.
One chapter
Yeah,
in Global Nine, right?
one chapter. Yeah. I bet I know what chapter. Touch upon it in US history. Great. Thank you, Mary. Okay, a little bit in AP US. Okay, a lot of Latin America. Very quickly in US. Okay. All right. So I see there's taking some of the history, but not so much within the classroom, it looks like. So now I have one final question. How many of you teach anything about crime or drugs in your classes? So let's see if there's any responses to that.
And it's starting to change.
Yeah. Okay, some say I teach it, I cover the mob. Okay, yes, mob was very much involved. Hard to teach about drugs and crime to fourth graders. That's true. Current events, just the names. Okay. Okay. A brief about illegal. Okay. So not in the fifth grade. All right. So this helps me get an idea of where you are a little bit. And so if you have any questions, many of you have a background in Latin American history, but some of you don't. So feel free to ask and anytime, and I'll try and I actually wrote this to really position it. So I'll be moving between U.S. and Latin American history. So just to kind of get started, is that recently Mexican history and questions of crime and violence re-entered the popular imagination when during the presidential campaign, at then Republican candidate Donald Trump stated the following. When Mexico, and he did this on June 16th, 2015, stated this. When Mexico sends its people, they are not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with them. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. Now, this is highly problematic to begin with, to actually have such a statement regarding people within the United States, as well as one of our largest trading partners. But unfortunately, that was not the first time things like that had been stated. So, what I want to do, as problematic as this quote is, I'm going to problematize it even further and reflect upon it as a historical continuity of what US politicians and policing agents who have made similar comments, but ignore the complexity and the causality in the history of violence and crime. So, what we're going to do is we're going to discuss a 100-year question, and I'm going to focus on a series of questions. And actually, these questions are embedded in this slide, which is a great slide of agave. But they're behind the photos too dark. So the first question is, what are the historical continuities and complexities of such a discourse among US policymakers? Another one, how has the United States' century-long war on drugs heightened tensions between the United States and Mexico? And lastly, how has the American demand for drugs and narcotics contributed to violence in Mexico? So in this presentation, we're actually going to we're not going to race, but we're going to talk about 100 years of a historically complex situation. And we're going to address how these wars have changed over time, but also relative continuities. And we're going to consider time and place and people and events that further complicate this history. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be weaving US and Mexican history into this discussion. I'm also going to be talking a little bit about some of the prominent scholars in the field. So if you so desire, you can pursue some of this on your own and look at some of the work that is coming out on the history of drugs and the history of violence. So for all of you in California, here's this great photo of Californians enjoying a day in poppy fields. And this is from 1895, as you can see where it's stamped. And just a brief question, where does poppy originate? Does anyone know?
And you can see, Elaine, the way this will work tonight is when you pose a question like that, then now we have multiple attendees typing.
Okay, yeah,
A
China,
lot of China
China,
guess, Afghanistan.
Afghanistan, Middle East, Asia, Iraq. Okay, Asia, great. Afghanistan. So Afghanistan is a major producer of opium and obviously heroin, an opiate derivative. Martin Booth, in his work Opium, A History, he has actually argued that you see evidence, and he's building this on a number of works, of evidence of poppy in Europe, in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, as well as throughout Asia. Where poppy is not indigenous is Mexico. So while Mexico does produce and grows opium poppy, it is not indigenous to Mexico. So one of the things that, and just not only with Martin Booth's work, you can also look at Alfred McCoy's The Politics of Heroin to get a really great understanding. Alfred McCoy is really one of one of the people who really shaped the history of drugs in the United States. So poppy in Mexico and drug use rates in Mexico have been very, very low until quite recently. And just not only is poppy not indigenous to Mexico, neither is cocaine. And I'm sure if I said, um, where do you in fact see where is cocaine? Where is its origins? And I'll give you a few minutes. And as Cheryl asked, why wouldn't we nuclear bomb the fields? Because we would have nuclear fallout, most likely. And poppy can be used for other things, cosmetics and things like that. So, and we know that it's also widely used for medicinal purposes, which is more. South America, is that Bolivia? Yeah, Colombia. Okay, yes, yes, excellent. So it is, so again, while Mexico has become involved in cocaine production, it is not indigenous. Marijuana is also not indigenous to Mexico. One of the things that has happened over the years is that marijuana became associated with Mexican migrants. In fact, one of the leaders of the field, David Musto, actually said, he's a historian who also created the field, mentioned that there might be evidence that Mexican workers brought marijuana to the United States. Now, this is because it's not indigenous to Mexico. One other evidence suggests that sailors from across the globe have been instrumental in moving commodities all over the world. Of course, coming through trade routes as well, across land. So we have, coming through trade routes, but we also have taking to the seas. So, just as many of you, most likely, if you are teaching anything about Mexico, I'm sure you're teaching the Columbian Exchange, you are familiar with those products that originate in Mexico. And marijuana is not one that originates in Mexico. And the reason, though, that it becomes viewed as part of Mexico is one is it's the production of marijuana as well as poppy. And the reason also now cocaine is that Mexico's climate is conducive to growing all sorts of crops because the country has one of the most rich it's one of the richest in biodiversity. So this is why we've kind of seen this ongoing, in some case, questions about the aspect of production, which is in Mexico. And of course, Mexico shares a 2,000-mile border with the United States. And the United States has historically had more demand for drugs and narcotics and cocaine than many other countries in the world. And that is something that has facilitated this trade. So, when does the United States become particularly concerned about addiction? Does anyone know when the United States really becomes involved in trying to control questions of addiction? 1980s, 1930s, those are times where the US, yes, Ronald Reagan's just say no. 1930s, because the end of prohibition. 1970s, Nixon's drug war. Election cycles, yes, always. Drug addiction, the 60s, definitely. 1920s, also because of the roaring 20s and drug use. Reefer Madness, again, coming in the 20s and 30s in the United States. But where the US really becomes concerned is after the Spanish American War. Now, initially, they are becoming concerned because we find opiate derivatives were in many, many things that people took, and doctors routinely prescribed them for any type of ailment, respiratory illnesses. Heroin was widely prescribed for asthmatics um, prior to 1914. Um, Opiates were also found in gripe water, so things you would give a baby to actually stop it from crying or help with colic. So, but what really changed it was after the Spanish American War and the US acquires the Philippines. Yes, Coca Cola originally, as Amy said, had cocaine in it. And cocaine tooth drops for babies. Exactly. So you had cocaine tooth drops for babies as well as opiate derivatives for gripe water. So babies were actually being addicted in the 1800s. So doctors were talking about this. But what begins to happen is that once are in the Philippines, they become introduced to a lot of use of, well, particularly opium smoking. And so this begins to lead a greater cause, and the United States becomes more interested in controlling the opium trade as well as the drug trade. So that is happening in the United States. But in Mexico, a prominent criminologist, Carlos Romagnac, who actually wrote a book called "The Criminals of Mexico." It's actually available online through the New York Public Library, and his name is spelled. Let me just type it in here so you can have it. And so if you Google his name, you can actually, it's in Spanish, it's not translated. So if you can read Spanish, you can actually read it, but there are parts that are translated. So he was already concerned about drug use, and he was writing about drug usage in Mexico. And in fact, we recognize too scholars such as Isaac Campos in his book Homegrown. He actually shows this growing concern about the use of marijuana in Mexico that actually predates what we would refer to as reefer madness in the United States. And part of this were these early criminologists who were working in the late 1800s and the early 1900s in Mexico. So in Mexico, this was in part they were noticing as marijuana as a commodity within prisons, and they were documenting this. Romagnac actually documented this very early on, and so we can see these that not only is the United States grappling with these issues, but so is Mexico. So, as the United States is becoming more concerned about what's happening in the Philippines, they're also paying attention to what's happening in Mexico. And beginning in 1908, Charles H. Brent, was an Episcopal minister who had been in the Philippines and really becomes an early drug warrior, he visited Mexico and he actually voiced concern about the lack of control of Mexican ports. And so he creates this different type of argument of saying, look, what we're starting to see is Asian based opiates are coming in and crossing the US Mexico border. And, um, and so this is where things began to change. And some of you were writing here about restrictive immigration legislation in the 1880s and the 1920s. Exactly. The Chinese Exclusion Act, and we're also going to talk about some of the things that are happening in Mexico too. So in 1914, the United States passes the Harrison Act. In 1912, there was a conference, an international conference, Opium Conference, and Mexico actually sent delegates. But as many of you know, and you probably do teach, the Mexican Revolution started. And this is a social revolution that lasts for more than a decade. And it really changes not only Mexico, but it changes relations on the US Mexico border. So, although there was ongoing questions about about territory and things like that since the U.S. Mexican War, and obviously dealing with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, people were freely crossing the border. Family for trade, business, and obviously migration. So the border will start to be strengthened because of the massive revolution. One is that questions about spillover of violence, but also because people who are in the revolution, they are fleeing the violence, and many of them are coming to the border. And I'm going to talk about some of this kind of movement a little bit and how that facilitates this drug exchange. So some, of course, will actually move into areas prior to, communities such as in Chicago and Detroit and Gary, Indiana, obviously throughout the Southwest and California, Texas. People were moving across seeking opportunities within the factories, and they settle into those areas. But people will also begin to flee the violence and start running across the U.S. Mexico border. And so the border starts to be strengthened at this particular time. Now, we know there are great revolutionary generals. Emiliano Zapata is one, and we have a huge, if you are a Latin American historian, you have taken just classes on the Mexican Revolution. And some of the most prominent Mexican revolutionary scholars are Alan Knight, Enrique Krause, John Womack, and Sam Brunk, to name a few. And as revolutionaries are celebrated for their valor, they are also involved in some other things. So, as the US is enforcing border restrictions, of course, this is in part because of Pancho Villa's raid in New Mexico, but also Villa had been smuggling as well, has been involved in banditry. And these are very famous cases of Pancho Villa. But we also know that other people had been involved. So what we see is on a time of this question about this changing about policing of drugs, and Mexico is very much involved in this. We're also seeing this social revolution that is essentially forcing people to move it's causing displacement, and people are going towards the border. So just like the United States under the Harrison Act, which is a little bit of that in your documents, which the Harrison Act essentially was controlling stores of opiates and cocaine that pharmacists had, and how they could distribute it. In Mexico, during the revolution, they will also make it illegal under President Carranza in 1916. It becomes illegal to produce, consume, and sell narcotics in Mexico. So in 1916, 2 years after the Harrison Act, Mexico passes a very similar act, a very similar law. And not only that, in the new constitution, they will form a Department of Health that had the sole rights to import and distribute morphine, heroin, and cocaine exclusively for medicinal purposes. So Mexican laws on the distribution of narcotics are strengthening. However, on the US side, we see kind of associate use of marijuana because of corridos such as La Cucaracha and things like that. And we start to kind of create this aspect as certain drugs are associated with Mexicans. So as we're having these questions about really looking at these changes in narcotics along the US Mexico border, as border security is tightened and heightened, and people are moving to the north to try and flee the violence, and they're trapped, how do you think they're going to survive? What would they have to do economically to survive along the US Mexico border during the Mexican Revolution? So
Let's give folks, that seems to be a pretty critical question, Elaine, that you're asking, not in a trivial way. So let's give folks a chance to answer this, and maybe not just answer it literally, but almost also speculate on that sort of path in life.
Okay, break the laws, traffic drugs. Would it just be drugs, or what else would they be selling and moving across the border? We're talking 19. Remember, the revolution starts in 1910 and it's going into the 1920s. Do what they can to feed their families? Exactly. Tequila, right. Drugs, prostitution, goods and services to make money. In some cases, there is arms trafficking. Usually, the arms are flowing from the United States to Mexico, a historical continuity. Bootleg liquor, right. So what you're writing about is, in fact, how are people going to survive when they have very little economic opportunities? And so, in some cases, what we see very early on is journalists and customs agents begin to notice these flows of alcohol and whiskey, tequila, as well as narcotics. And of course, very early on, journalists start to note that women are involved in these illegal flows. So the aspects of how people are going to survive, and the other aspect, just as women and people of modest background are moving to the boards, they're also far away, very far away from the power structures of, say, Washington, D.C. and Mexico City. So what we actually see is a very different, and for those of you who live in California and who are living in the Southwest, is there is a border culture that is dramatically different from, say, the Deep South or the Pacific Northwest or here in the Northeast. And in some cases, in those areas where there's economic changes, violence, there is also sometimes economic opportunities, not only for men, but also for women. And we see this. It's part of the great narrative of the history of the American West, but it's also a part of the history of the U.S. Mexico borderlands. So While there is continued unrest in the 1920s, really Mexico does embark on building a modern state. And there are things, there are land revolts, there is the Cristero Rebellion, which is associated with land, but also with religion. And also, you have a population that has been fighting for over a decade. And there are these large armies at the same time, a society that in a country that has been economically destroyed and much of the infrastructure has been destroyed. So one, you have to demilitarize the people, but you also have to offer them some aspect of how they would do this and how they would go back to maybe a civilian life. And some will go back to their farms, but others will move into cities. But these questions about how do you provide for your armies, and the armies were not these national armies. People rose up in different states and followed particular leaders, such as Zapata, such as Villa, such as Carranza. And so all of a sudden, what you start to see is some men who were revolutionary leaders, who were revolutionary generals, particularly along the U.S. Mexico border. They have demilitarized their men, but they are also these bosses, these caciques. They have been these generals, and they have these men who are expecting to be somehow rewarded. So, what we see sometimes is certain generals entered into the drug trade. And one of them who's very famous is General Esteban Cantu, you know, in Baja California, um, accent on the U. Uh, Also, he was a supporter of Villa and Carranza, but he would also later grant leases to opium producers and smugglers. And of course, where would they be smuggling? What cities would be the destiny for these opium producers and smugglers if he was in Baja California? Where do you think the biggest market was?
Let's see.
Exactly.
We've got some guesses coming in.
Yep. LA,
Yeah.
California, right. All up and down the Pacific coast because they would also start to use boats and ships. Very, very. San Diego, exactly. Now he will actually be pushed out by another general, General Abelardo Rodriguez, who would take over the drug trade in Baja California, a very lucrative market. And he would ultimately become president in 1932 and 1934. Not only do we have in Baja California, we also have similar situations of the revolutionary general Plutarco Calles, who was also governor of Sonora, and then who would become president from 1924 to 28 and really kind of run the country until 1934. And so what we have are these generals, again, far from the center of power, Mexico City, but very powerful along the US Mexico border, who are engaging in kind of this, what we would say, um, in vice culture. And of course, what happens in the United States that really facilitates this rise of and for these men to gain more and more power. What happens in the 20s that changes that economy along the US Mexico border? Exactly, prohibition. So all of a sudden, Mexico has a really lucrative revenue stream coming in to the border areas, as well as throughout the other part of the country because of where production is taking place. So while we have this going on in the U.S. Mexico border, in Mexico City, we actually see people attempt, many politicians, medical doctors, who are working to build a new country. And the Department of Health is not only trying to control questions of disease and ensure access to clean water and rebuild the infrastructure and improve sanitation. They're trying to build police departments, hospitals, schools, all of that. But they are also becoming very concerned about ridding vice. And not only in Mexico City, but this kind of movement will also come into the US Mexico border. And finally, in the 1920s, under then Mexico President Alvaro Obregón, who was also a former general, Mexico will formally sign those international agreements from 1908, 1912, and those will be signed in the 1920s. But remember, even though they're signatories to these international agreements, they had already changed their own laws in 1916 and 1917. So as I was talking
Elaine,
about a lot,
Elaine,
yeah,
let me ask you
yeah.
one quick question before we move any further. And we're right on time, by the way, and folks are really finding this compelling. I can see from the chat box, but I do want to ask this one question. A history of violence is the title of tonight's webinar. We've talked, you've alluded to this violence. I don't want to be elementary here, but I do want to be explicit about what we're talking about because I think making the point of choices people have in their lives and and the paths they find themselves on is an important piece here. Can you tell us exactly what violence means in the way that you're using the term? You know,
Well, in this case, I think as we're going along, as I'm talking about, because I'm now going to actually
yeah,
start really addressing these questions of
great,
violence.
okay.
So during the Mexican Revolution, there's tremendous amounts of violence, and it destabilizes the country. So if we're talking about people, if you have levels of violence, people will start to flee. They will start to, that's where you get internal displacement. And that happened in 1910, and it's happening now. So there's a correlation between increased levels of violence and internal displacement in Mexico.
I,
It's the exact same thing is happening 100 years from 1910 to the present.
right. I guess my question is
So
when you say violence, and again, not to be elementary here, but you mean murder, death.
murder, death, deprivation during the revolution, destroying the cities,
Yes.
destroying the rail lines, the infrastructure, the bridges. So now what we're seeing is not so much of a destruction of the infrastructure, but terrorizing the population. And they did that during the revolution too. Um, and there's great, novels about this, about people, families hiding their daughters because the women in the family would be raped. They would lose if they had a farm, everything would be taken so a general might come in and take everything, and then the people would then starve. They would have nothing left.
So you just
So
used words, Elaine, that to me, I mean, it really changes this conversation. I think we all understand violence in the abstract, but when you use words like terrorize, murder, rape, I mean, I mean, this isn't just running from discomfort. This is a life and death choice.
no, this is escaping because civilians are caught between armies fighting each other.
Right. I think that's a
And
critical point
so,
to make.
yes, yeah, just as people previously in Ciudad Juarez or now in cities like Tampico or Veracruz, they are trapped between dueling groups, these groups that are fighting within these cities. And that is what is creating internal displacement and why we have growing numbers of people seeking asylum in the United States. So this is part of what while Mexico is really building this modern society, they're also doing similar things that we see in the United States. So, for instance, we have during the 1920s, as I mentioned, Plutarco Calles, he actually orchestrates what is known as the anti-Chinese movement in Mexico. And he terrorizes the Chinese community, many of whom came to Mexico to where there were agreements to work in the hot lands, to work in agriculture. Others would come after the 1905 earthquake in San Francisco and come to Mexico. And then others would come to Mexico due to the Chinese Exclusion Act. So there were large Chinese Mexican communities along the U.S. Mexico border. And so in states such as Baja California and Sonora, but also in states like Tamaulipas and Veracruz. So he begins to orchestrate this of really saying that questions of drug use and drug violence are associated with the Chinese and not. And so men who identified themselves as Mexican and who've been in the country, all of a sudden they're seen as a foreign menace and they are rounded up for deportation. Wives of these men would send letters to the government, to the president, demanding and asking, well, begging, not demanding, begging that their husbands be released because they had children. they had businesses, and that they didn't identify as Chinese. They identified as Mexican. So this is in part what begins to, in fact, change the kind of this aspect of how Mexicans begin to view people from who are Mexico as a country that had lots of immigration, but that this particular group of immigrants were seen as quote unquote foreign and bringers of vice and crime. Sounds somewhat familiar. Um, so well, thank you for the translation. So the other aspect is, as these questions about the anti-Chinese, the questions of deportation and kind of blaming Chinese, and there were these massive groups that would do this within, they would be organized. And it's very similar to what you see happening in California, but also in Canada, particularly in British Columbia. It was so bad, in fact, that the Chinese consulars would begin to actually defend people within the country. So it really created a crisis in Mexico. But as Mexico begins the anti-Chinese movement, they begin that there's obviously more than one group that is involved, and they become concerned with schoolyard pushers. This would also be common in the 1920s and 30s in the United States. And again, in along the U.S. Mexico border on the U.S. side, all of a sudden drugs and drug vending is becoming associated with Mexicans. And they become targeted as being kind of the creators of vice, similar to what was happening in Mexico with Chinese, but also obviously previously in the United States. What's interesting is that in the late 1920s, Charles Edward Terry, who worked for the Bureau of Social Hygiene through the Rockefeller Foundation, argued that Mexicans and Mexican Americans had little or no drug abuse evidence compared to Anglos who were living along the U.S. Mexico border. So the evidence, on one hand, coming out of the medical field is dramatically different from what is happening on in the criminal aspect. And of course, as we talked about, prohibition would escalate some of these things just because of the flow of drugs. Um, it would bring organized crime, obviously becomes more prominent in the United States. It would also bring organized crime to Mexico, and US organized crime would start linking with Mexican organized crime. So beginning in the 1920s, we see men such as Hugh McClemmy, who he was written about by the Coast Guard. He's using not only ships, but also planes to smuggle not only alcohol, but drugs from Rosarita in Baja California throughout California and the Pacific Northwest. So we can see that there is this relationship that is being developed very, very early, due in part to prohibition, as some of you talked about, this question of organized crime. So while these questions are happening, as we're starting to see these arguments about association with crime, association with drugs and violence, we also recognize in 1929, with the collapse of the economy, while Americans were drinking Mexican spirits and going across the border to dance in the clubs, at the same time they began to form Mexican bureaus and begin a mass deportation of Mexicans known as the Mexican repatriation. So we can see kind of economic things, but we also have these other arguments about this question of drugs and crime that are emerging. So on one hand, there would be arguments about Mexicans taking jobs away from quote unquote native born Americans, even if Mexican Americans were born in the United States, but at the same time associating these questions of crime. And so you have these multiple levels of rhetoric. And one of the best books about it is Francisco Valderrama and Raymond Rodriguez's Decade of Betrayal. There's also great collections at the Los Angeles Library, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with. Families were split apart, property was confiscated. It was economically devastating for Mexican and Mexican American families in the United States, not only in the Southwest, but also in places such as Chicago and Detroit. So we begin to have kind of this all these things that are kind of coordinated at the same time. But what really begins to happen with the drug situation is with prohibition ending, Harry J. Anslinger will become director of a new organization called the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which is under the Department of Treasury. He will be the leader of that from 1930 into 1963, when the Bureau of Narcotics will become, well, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics will become the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs from 63, 73, and then become the Drug Enforcement Administration. So Anslinger is this person who really understood media in a way that we can understand now, but he had this grasp very, very early. He would give talks to any group, women's groups, school groups. He would be on writing for magazines. He was a tireless warrior. A great book on him is John McMillan's book, The Protectors, H.J. Anslinger and the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Anslinger had never been a police officer. He was a diplomat. And he had been involved in some of those early meetings about drug control. But what he did do is that he changed how we begin to understand drugs and really relating questions of crime. So one of the things that he does is this question of reefer madness, and he used this particular case over and over again of Viktor Licata in Tampa, Florida, who murders his entire family on October 17, 1933. And he argues that that Licata was Mexican, and that he, in fact, was driven to murder his family because of smoking marijuana. It's questionable whether he was Mexican. It's also questionable this idea that marijuana made him do it. He kills a fellow prisoner in an asylum in Florida after he is placed in that asylum after killing his family, and then he ends up killing himself. But this becomes this national emblem of who he is. And some of you have asked questions about people being fearful of being deported to Mexico because of the drugs and violence, and that's absolutely correct. So these are questions, but we can kind of see, in fact, this idea that Mexico is responsible for, and Mexicans are responsible for bringing marijuana, and Licata becomes the face of that, of this question of reefer madness, as we all know.
And you know, Elaine, I got to say, looking at that picture, if you wanted the face of Reefer Madness, that's it right there.
Well, and this is what he showed. I mean, as you can even see the tag on it, it's highly sensational,
Exactly.
right?
Right.
The most heinous crime of 1933. Again, it's putting this aspect of creating an enemy. At the same time, when we know repatriation is going on, Mexican repatriation is happening. So it's even though frequently they're not discussed together, they're reinforcing one another. So marijuana becomes as Anslinger and others, because this in the 30s, this is when the laws would change, and marijuana would begin to become illegal. And to Anslinger, he associates Asians, Mexicans, and African Americans with marijuana, with drugs, who are in fact intoxicating white, able-bodied Americans. And he positions himself as really the savior that can, if we can just control questions, and this deals with questions of immigration and policing and all of this, even though we know for the Rockefeller Foundation, in fact, that many groups that he was associating, constantly saying this, he was never talking about who is demanding these things, who is demanding, where is the demand, and who is demanding. So let me ask just a question. So while we have these roots, so in the United States, marijuana was predominantly coming from Mexico, and at the time in the 20s and 30s, obviously some heroin. But most of the heroin was coming from Asia and Europe, Asian or Middle Eastern based heroin that would then be trafficked through Europe. So, what do you think happens to this drug trade during World War II? The Asian and the European organizations that are trafficking heroin to the country that, and to two countries, because also this would include Canada, although at a lesser, that had some of the greatest demand. So does it just shift? Why would it shift? Right.
Hmm.
Supply
Exactly.
would be cut off. Exactly. Supply would be cut off. So remember, Mexico had always been a site of transshipment. So ships would come in and it would be, uh, U.S. organized crime, such as Cohen and the 107th gangs, 107th Street gang in here in New York. They were actually receiving European, coming from the Middle East, but via Europe, based heroin, repackaging it, and trafficking it across the U.S. Mexico border. They were doing that, or putting it on planes. They were using planes very early and bringing it across the border. So, what happens in World War II is all of a sudden those lines are cut off. So, Mexico begins to become, it's already been a producer, but now it's becoming a big producer. So, in my book, Women Drug Traffickers, one of the women I talk about is Maria Dolores Esteves Zuleta, who was the boss of Mexico City, Lola Licata. And she was involved in the drug trade from the early 1900s until the 1950s. And Anslinger knew her and knew her by name. He never spoke about her by name in a public forum, but he would talk about her in internal memos. She becomes involved in the drug trade via her mother, who sold initially chicharron and coffee, but then moved into the more lucrative market of marijuana and morphine. And just like then and now, morphine and marijuana is far more lucrative than chicharron. Chicharron is pork rind and coffee. So she works as her mom's burro, but where she gets her training, she's displaced from Mexico City. That's where she's from. And she ends up in Ciudad Juarez for a time and makes her way back to Mexico City. She is so successful, and so that yeah, Chata refers to a flat face exactly. She Anslinger is demanding her arrest in Mexico during World War II, but she is joined by another, the boss of Ciudad Juarez, who Ignacio Jasso Laveuda de Gonzalez, also known as La Nacha. Now, because she was along the U.S. Mexico border, she in fact has a huge kind of distribution network. And she is, they attempt to arrest her in 1942. Anslinger was trying to entice her across the border so he could arrest her because he realized what she controlled in places such as El Paso and throughout the Southwest. When he sends undercover agents to her, she actually brags that her heroin is being sold on the streets of Detroit, Toronto, and New York. She and Lola Chata stepped in, as well as other Mexican drug dealers, stepped into that market because of the demand. So she will actually be arrested in 1942, and she stays in prison throughout World War II, but in Mexico, and she's never extradited. However, in 1948, her extradition case is thrown out of the courts in Texas. And here is this thing that she is the fall of the opium queen. And this is in American Weekly. So she is in the psyche of the Americans. She's being talked about. She is also in that congressional report in your document. She is the one who's denounced on the floor of the Congress. And this says that she is selling tamales, and here she is right there, selling tamales in Jalisco. Well, in Jalisco is where she had her laboratories. That's where she processed her heroin. Her farms were in Chihuahua as well as in her home state of Durango. And she also grew cotton. She had also very, legal businesses too. Uh, But this idea that she's somehow just selling tamales in Jalisco is really more of a hope than the actual fact. So we see that women are involved in this, and this is when during World War II, not only are women involved and men involved, but they are making ties with these organized crime groups in the United States who are doing drugs. So, of course, after what we also know too, after the Mexican repatriation, then the US will begin the Bracero program because they need labor. And Mexicans will return to the United States. At the same time, Mexico will also declare war on the Axis powers. There will be Mexicans who will go into the Marine Corps as well as serve in other, and Mexican Americans obviously serve in the other branches of the military. They will also, the Mexican president, Manuel Avila Camacho, would go after not only drug traffickers, he will arrest all drug traffickers without due process due to the demands of the United States in 1945, as well as going after communists and fascists. The president that would follow him, Miguel Alemán, would actually form the Federal Directorate of Security, or the DFS, in 1947. And this would be encouraged by the United States, kind of combined CIA and FBI methods. And the purpose of the DFS was to seek out those who would undermine the nation, particularly initially fascists and communists. So, what begins to, these are changing. Again, the US is making demands, arrest drug traffickers. And again, demand in the United States is not being is being addressed better than it was later, but maybe not at the same level. Again, there's this criminalization. Mexico would also be responding to U.S. demands to spray the fields in Mexico, and they would willingly do this. So this is happening at the same time as the changes in the labor and the Bracero program. So some of the great works and recent works about Bracero programs includes Deborah Cohen's Braceros, Migrant Citizens and Transnational Subjects, and Julie Weiss's Corazon de Dixie, Mexicans in the U.S. South since 1910, which is also a great teaching tool because she has some of her documents online. So I encourage you to kind of Google that, Corazon de Dixie. So where did braceros go? So here you can see where braceros were in the United States and where the states from which they also came. So we can see that they're working in many, many parts of the United States. And in fact, this is Weiss actually talks about some other areas here in the South.
So Elaine, if you don't mind going back,
But
if you don't mind going back to that map for me, I mean, what's
okay.
there it
Oops,
is.
sorry.
That's okay. I mean, it's really stark to see the difference between the blue states and the beige ones or the green ones, light green ones.
Yeah.
And
And these are there is some Weiss actually says documents that some of these states, in fact, even though they didn't participate in the program, they were actually the farmers were getting braceros.
I think Vanessa,
So we're talking about just about every state.
right. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So the gold are the states that did not participate in the Bracero program, and the blue are the states that did. But as I mentioned, if you read Weiss's book, she'll actually talk about how certain farmers were, in fact, even though the state wasn't participating, they were using Bracero labor. So, of course, again, as we start to see in the wake of World War II, remember we talked about how there was this question about crime and the repatriation? We see a reemergence about concern about drugs and crime again, and at the same time as Operation Wetback in the United States in 1954 under the Eisenhower. So, not only do we have this going on, at the same time in 1955, the Senate actually begins a hearing about the illicit narcotics trade. And Ruben Salazar, very famous Mexican American journalist who was born in Ciudad Juarez, testifies. And again, La Nacha reappears in the popular imaginations. And what's interesting about this is she is seen, and other women, in fact, one other Mexican woman who was involved in the drug trade, they start talking about how hanging would be appropriate. So almost as if, and we know that Mexicans were lynched, and here in 1955, they're talking about, well, women and Mexican women and men involved in the drug trade should perhaps be hanged publicly. So again, this question of violence and this kind of moral panic reemerges that Mexicans are intoxicating quote unquote Americans. And in this picture right here, this, and her house still stands. Her house is here where the truck is. I don't know if you can, so in the background, there's a truck, and that's where she lived. This is a really interesting map. It's along, you can kind of, and I'm sorry it's not very good because I can't check the book out and go get it properly scanned because it's, but it took me forever to find this book, this map, because people cut them out of the hearings. And this is, you can see the international boundary, and the little dots are the heroin shooting galleries that La Nacha and her family controlled on both the U.S. and Mexico side of the border.
And Elaine,
So here is this
Elaine, who
aspect.
would
Yeah.
create this kind of map?
Well, the map was created by people working on this particular issue, and Salazar presented it.
Got it.
It was offered by him, but I don't think he wasn't a map maker, so I don't think he created it. I think he had been doing a lot of stories about drug use on both sides of the border. Um, and so he, in fact, probably marked the areas, working with some of the policing agents on both sides of the border. So he created this, he actually gave the testimony and offered this map to the Senate, the senators in 1955. So again, this creates this whole aspect about this concern that Mexico is again creating problems for the U.S. and that they are, bringing drugs across, and not really in the context of saying where is the demand. And what also comes out in this is they're starting to realize that there is a lot of demand and that Americans are working for some of the Mexican drug traffickers. A lot of the drug traffickers along the US border guaranteed delivery on the other side, but they weren't involved in distribution. So people were purchasing, they were supplying, but the biggest profit is made at point of sale, not at the supply side, because it's growing exponentially. So who was distributing? And in fact, these were Americans who were involved in distribution throughout the United States. But again, in this case, and they were focusing on some of them trying to understand it. But again, what you see is this aspect that who is at fault, and it's the point of supply, rather than this more complex question about it's not just supply, it's transportation, it's distribution, it's storage, it's then moving it from one place to another, storing, and then distributing to people who are actually selling.
And that's, and
Lots of people
Elaine,
involved.
that's what you just described is a complicated infrastructure of economy, right? I
Exactly.
mean,
It's
that's,
a it's a it's a very complex supply chain, unbelievably complex. And so to say that she is to blame, La Nacha is to blame, just doesn't quite capture the complexity of in fact, the entire economic chain. And remember, it's more lucrative at point of sale. So a distributor would most likely be making more than the supplier. And that's the difference. And the distributors were frequently,
let,
they
let
were
me take
Americans.
let me
It was
take just a
cross.
moment there, Elaine, and ask you this question. And right now it's about 10 minutes after 8, so we've got about 20 more minutes. And so I don't want to take you too far astray, but in your own work and in your own research as an historian, how much how much did you personally have to really understand about economics and economic systems and sort of that level of human economic relationships in order to fully understand this issue?
Years. I mean, it was because I started as a social historian writing on 1968, that so it took me years to understand it. And that meant interviewing lots of police, lots of detectives, narcotics agents on both sides of the border. talking to DEA. So it was, I had a, a huge education working with anthropologists and sociologists who had been studying, working with other historians in the U.S. and in Mexico, and in some cases in Europe and Canada too. So it took me years. So just to kind of get back, the 1960s, we were all talking about the 1960s earlier, but even in Mexico, Diaz Ordaz was very angry. When he becomes president, he's very angry about hippies and others coming to Mexico asking for drugs. And that's what people were doing. They were coming and saying, asking for drugs. During the 1968 Mexican student movement, he would actually argue that Americans who collaborated with the Soviets and Cubans, the only time, were all involved in intoxicating well behaved Mexican youth to actually protest. So you can see kind of these this blame game kind of going back and forth between the two countries. Now, Diaz Ordaz was president at a time where the heightened drug war takes place. And some of you had mentioned this, 1970s, and that's exactly correct. Richard Nixon ran on an anti-drug platform, and was the architect of one of the modern drug wars. He formed the Special Presidential Task Force relating to narcotics, marijuana, and dangerous drugs. This changed how the U.S. Mexico border looked. They actually did huge infrastructure. They also formed the DEA out of, as I mentioned, the FBN and then the BNDD. But they also did something else, which was Operation Intercept, where they shut down the US Mexico border. And we've heard this kind of rhetoric recently, and this was absolutely devastating to the one. It really it hurt him because people were enraged who live on the border. They're like, wait a minute, we can't go across and see our family. I live on one side of the border, work on the other side. I have business on both sides. So this actually backfired in some ways for him. It was a fiasco. And the Mexican government would, in fact, get benefits from the United States, particularly military aid in fighting drugs, heightened military aid and training at this time. With the following president, Luis Echeverria, during his presidency, remember we talked about the DFS, the Federal Director of Security. DFS agents were discovered to be starting to work with drug trafficking organizations. So they were going after communists and people who were destabilizing the state, but they were also coming into labs and caches of drugs. And this is when they begin to be recruited by drug trafficking organizations. Essentially, they're bribed and they're recruited. So at that time, we begin to see the demand in the US is growing. Top commanders in the DFS are not only highly trained, in some cases they're working with the DEA, and others are involved in the drug trade. But we also see a growing sophistication of drug traffickers. One of the first one is Alberto Cecilia Falcon. He was a Cuban national who becomes a very successful marijuana and cocaine trafficker based in Mexico along the U.S. Mexican border in the 1970s. But not only was he involved in trafficking, he moved in elite circles on both sides of the border. He had highly connected friends and tremendous wealth. He was so wealthy and respectable that he, in fact, almost gained the rights to manufacture certain U.S. firearms in Mexico, which was a clear violation of the country's laws. But U.S. businessmen were willing to do business with him. What stopped that was his arrest and a Senate hearing into his wealth and his ties to people on both sides of the border. So he is a really kind of that beginning of where we start to see this escalation. What also would further create problems and really escalate was the murder of Enrique Camarena, the DEA agent, in 1985. He was stationed at the Guadalajara regional office. He was kidnapped, he was brutally tortured, and he was murdered. His murderers were Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo and his lieutenant Rafael Caro Quintero. And evidence suggests that Caro Quintero had planned the murder, and when he was arrested, he actually had a DFS identification card. So this is really what begins to draw more and more skepticism of the DFS, but also of the commitment to really struggling with the drug trade. With the combating his death, we actually begin to see growing literature. So I just have a slide here of, you can go back and look at these of prominent scholars now working on the drug trade if you're interested in more work on this. Someone asked a question about who took over for El Chapo. It's not a person, it's not run in, as one person. It's more like a multinational corporation. And just so you know, there was an article recently in the New York Times how he's becoming a prisoner's rights advocate in the MCC, which is the Metropolitan Correction Center here in Manhattan. So let's talk more about this modern period. Mexico experienced a great economic boom through the 50s, 40s, 50s, and 60s and 70s. But by the 1980s, that boom is declining. And one of the things that would also begin that as that miracle becomes to an end, there's massive internal migration into cities beginning in the 1970s. And obviously, there is movement out of the rural areas into the United States, and that would be accelerated by debt crisis, peso devaluations, and NAFTA. So here is this a map where you can see the areas that are controlled by different organizations. One of the things that escalates the violence is in 2007, with encouragement from the United States, President Felipe Calderon declared a war on drugs, and the military begins to play a bigger role. He fired many police officers, particularly in states that, like in Chihuahua and in others, and this created, because he saw them as being involved in the drug trade. And when he declared this war, battles were raging between different organizations. The drug traffickers had become more sophisticated. Remember, I said with the DFS, they're training people, and others are being trained by the US or European or Israeli experts. And one of those was Los Zetas, an organization that was formed by military commandos who were recruited to be the muscle of the Gulf Cartel. And then there was another organization similar that would be recruited by the Sinaloa cartel, which is La Linea. What are they doing? They're battling for those ports of entry along the U.S. Mexico border. And again, this question of demand facilitates that. So, yeah, the fix is very good. Yeah, someone wrote, Amy wrote about the fix. And so what begins in this question of the fighting of the drugs is we know that they're battling for these territories. This war on drugs really kind of escalated it. We also see a fractionalization that takes place around. And when things fractionalize, meaning organizations were bigger and under one umbrella, as they begin to fractionalize, they're harder to police in Mexico. One of the questions was about MS-13. MS-13 has been recruited into other organizations. They're particularly involved in human smuggling, but also in some cases in drugs. But they've actually, because Mexican organizations control the drugs, MS-13 works jointly with them, but more involved in human trafficking. Obviously also in drugs, but not at the level of these organizations that I'm mentioning here. So what we begin to see is, as I talked about during the Mexican Revolution, where we started to see that civilians are trapped between these warring factions. And once you have levels of violence, people begin to shift. So not only are we see the escalation of violence, and somebody asked about the decapitations, which again is to terrorize not only the population, but to terrorize the government too. So in states such as Tamaulipas and Chihuahua, now Tamaulipas, but in Chihuahua previously, businesses were shuttered. And we see in 2014, close to 300,000 Mexicans were displaced, and this number just continues to grow. In Ciudad Juarez, in the state of Chihuahua, 24,000 people fled in 2012. Of those who fled, Ciudad Juarez, because many people say, oh, well, the people who are running away, they don't have jobs and they're poor. But of those who fled Ciudad Juarez in 2012, 80% of them had jobs. So they're not running because they're looking for economic opportunities. They're running for their lives. Um, so I have met doctors who were in Ciudad Juarez and who fled to the center of the country. I have met people from all over who have left, and others who have fled, if they could, went to the U.S. side. And that's right, MS-13 actually begins in the United States with questions of deportation and becomes even bigger, not only in El Salvador, but also moves into other Central American countries. So as we're starting to see this, because people are running for their lives and they're coming to the United States and requesting asylum. So on one hand, they're fleeing to the same country where, in fact, the demand for drugs that has contributed to ongoing destabilization has occurred. And so we see this staggering death toll that has emerged in Mexico. Um, there are more civilian murders. Very few are investigated. This fall, I was actually not this fall, in the winter, I was at one of the research institutions, and people were talking about really trying to document and get a number, actually get the statistics to figure out, in fact, how many people have been killed during the drug violence. So there's no credible numbers. So scholars such as Sebastian Albuja, Steve Haig, Laura Rubio Diaz Leal, working with one of the universities, ITAM, as well as International Displacement Monitoring Center and the Norwegian Reporting Council, they have created these arguments of saying there's a direct correlation between violence and migration. And the violence itself is being driven in part by demand of drugs in the United States, gun flows, and supply. These are all creating together. It's not just supply.
Elaine, we just have a few more minutes. I don't want to speed you up necessarily, but I do feel that the point you just made, and
Yeah,
several people have mentioned in the chat box how eye-opening, how startling that last graph was, and I'm assuming as we move forward, but it really does kind of shift the entire conversation if you discuss displaced people running for their lives from violence versus people who are trying to come into this country for economic gain.
right. And I think that's what people, and here again is another example of the level of, you can see how low the homicide rate was and how it's spiking at different times. And just so you know, Mexico has some of the lowest homicide rates in the Americas. So I think that is also very telling. So just to conclude pretty briefly is that when we think about these questions of violence, for years there was an official silence in Mexico regarding internal as well as external displacement. As Andy was saying, that this idea that only poor people move to the United States because they're seeking opportunities and not really recognizing internal displacement. And that has changed dramatically. Where now in Mexico, there are human rights organizations and civil rights organizations that have brought this to the attention. And they're showing that, that there is internal displacement because of these issues. And they're attempting to address this with new laws. They're revising criminal justice codes. There's an attempt to improve policing, pay, benefits, training, and skills. And this is an ongoing process that is continuing to go. But other things, of course, are not so great. One is that we're seeing self-defense groups, as some of you are talking about, gangs and stuff that are emerging. And of course, we haven't the ongoing consideration of how drug money, is laundered in the United States and flows back, in some cases, in the form of guns and arms and other things to Mexico. The money has to be laundered somehow. And that's one way it is done. And it's done in many, many ways, but that is one way. So I wanted to just kind of, just show you this one image. This is the work by Elaine Marquez Salazar. He is from Sinaloa. And this is a series called Appeared. And he uses 19th century landscape painting as a motif. But as you can see, when you first look at the painting, what do you see? When you first look at the painting?
Let's see. I think the chat is catching up with your question, and it's the boy, Karen says.
You see the boy,
And
you see first the boy, right? But then when you look more closely, you see a bound body of somebody who's been murdered execution style. So the beauty of the Mexican landscape is marred by this bound and murdered body. And you can miss it if you don't pay attention to a young boy who's standing there with his arms crossed and is there living amongst this beautiful landscape, but at the same time with the mark the marks of violence. So my final questions, just to kind of go forward and to consider, is how has the continued insatiable demand for drugs among Americans altered the Mexican economy and society? And how has that contributed to violence and crime in Mexico over a century? And then lastly, as one of you already wrote, will a wall really stop the demand and really stop the violence? So I would be thrilled to entertain any questions or comments,
well,
rebuttal.
I've got a couple of questions. One I'm going to pull from the chat box, Elaine, and then one I'd like to ask myself. I'm going to give you both the questions, so in the limited time we have left, you can figure out the best way to answer them. Christy asks, in your opinion, what is the solution to this problem? That is the demand on drugs for drugs in the U.S. and maybe even outside the U.S. and the violence that comes from these drug gangs. What can be done really in the U.S. or in Mexico? And then my question, which you may actually find a way to wrap these two together, is, we have teachers now, 60, nearly 70 with us tonight, 175 who signed up, and we'll get a recording and the associated materials of this webinar. We've got teachers from all over the country who teach all levels, elementary through secondary level. In your view, Elaine, what would be kind of those critical one or two points or themes from tonight that our teachers should keep in mind as they talk about and think about this topic with their kids? What is the sort of big takeaway for you? And that may be an answer to Christy's question, which is the solution to this problem. Can you address both of those?
Yeah, I think in part we're starting to address some of the solutions, which is although it's about dealing with the opioid crisis here in the United States and attempting to recognize that this is a problem of addiction, it's a problem of health, and not treating it as a criminal aspect. And I think that has a profound impact on it's a I think an encouraging conversation to hear because that wasn't the conversation. Now, actually, we're starting to hear even rhetoric about a resurrection of the drug wars, and and I think that's very disturbing because I have great hope that if we begin to address these questions of demand, but also of treatment, of providing treatment, I think that could have a really big impact regardless of I think that the big points that we need to think about is why questions of what motivates people to flee and why they're fleeing and to be more sensitive that these kind of things like it's always economic opportunity, that history is more complex and we share a 2,000-mile border with Mexico and our histories are intertwined just as our landmass is connected, we are connected in ways that I think are far more complex than what you get in the media and in the rhetoric. So my question is to pause and to really think about what is being said and what are we telling our our students and how to respond to that. I mean, it's very hard, especially if you're teaching fourth graders, to really talk about historical complexity, but you can introduce those things. We know why people move, war and violence, deprivation, and to say that these are part of the things. And so I think it's kind of being more attentive to those questions of historical complexity.
Elaine, I've got one last question for you before we wrap up tonight. It's from Susie Q, who asks, uh, do you think that the decriminalization of marijuana is going to curb this violence in the drug trade and the violence in Mexico?
I think the decriminalization of marijuana will have some impact. Yes, it is still the it is still what is most heavily used, and it does move across. But um, And again, those seems to be again up in the air at this point in the moment. Will I think that will cure everything? And I'm not sitting here saying that if marijuana becomes legal in every state, it'll change dramatically. I don't know, but I think it could have um, some impact on those questions of violence. I think we also have to recognize too is that Mexico is, a very has a complex economy and has a lot of commodities that are moving, very legal commodities. And so part of this might be too is figuring out what types of agreements could be made
Mm.
across borders dealing with questions of legalized marijuana.
Elaine,
I
yep,
mean that hasn't started.
you're right. Elaine, I cannot thank you enough for joining and leading this conversation tonight. It's not just complex and compelling, but clearly a topic, the variety of threads there that are on our minds all the time. And all of the students that we work with and these teachers work with, have this in the background. And so we appreciate you giving us at least a little bit more insight on how to address that. I do want to thank all of our participants tonight. And Elaine,
Well,
thank you for being here.
well, thank you very much. Thank you so
And
much.
congratulations on your new position. And Elaine, by the way, happy birthday.
Well, thank you.
So I want to
Thank you
thank all
very
of our
much.
participants for being here tonight. Be sure to follow the National Humanities Center and American Class on social media. That's Facebook, that's Instagram, that's Twitter. Please also join us for our next webinar next Tuesday. This is a different night than usual. On May the 2nd, we will be doing a webinar on fake news, teaching historical understanding in a digital age. And this will actually there'll be a lot of differences in this webinar. We'll be using a new platform. We will also be hosting this at a different time, 4 p.m. Eastern Time. And the reason for that is that one of our lead speakers, Ben Walsh, is from England. And so he's going to be staying up pretty late to join us. And so we needed to start it a little bit earlier in the afternoon. If for some reason that interferes with your school day, you can always join us a little bit late, or you can open the room, you can continue with your business, and then join us as soon as you can. That session will be recorded as always. So next Tuesday, 4 o'clock East Coast time, we'll be doing a webinar on fake news. Thank you again, everybody. Be sure to fill out your evaluation and get your certificate. We will see you next time in American Class.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.